Welcome everyone. It's so great to have you here. Welcome for those who are on Zoom as well. My name is Sital Kalantry, and I'm a professor of law, associate dean, and the founding director of the Roundglass India Center. The center was founded in September through a generous gift of the Roundglass Foundation, which was started by Sunny Singh. Our goal is to support the study of India and the diaspora community, and to build bridges academically, culturally, and through business relationships with India and the United States. So our talk today, in line with this mission of studying the diaspora community, will discuss whether Indian Americans vote based on their politics or ethnicity. And we have no one better to talk about this probably in the world than Professor Karthick Ramakrishnan. He is a professor of public policy at UC Riverside and founder of and director of the AAPI data project. So really, I was actually at a conference with him in Princeton and just talking to him in the off sessions, and someone came up to him and said, "Hey, are you the AAP data guy?" So just evidence of how he's really created this whole idea that we need to think about what survey and think about what the Asian American community thinks about. He has 7 books, and most recently called Citizenship Reimagined and Framing Immigrants. He's been quoted in over 3,000 media stories about this topic. I could go on, but just to end with, he has a BA from Brown and a PhD from Princeton in politics. So before I start, a quick thank yous to the Indian American Community Services for co-sponsoring this event with us and for joining us in person. Yes, thank you for clapping. It's an amazing organization that we're proud to partner with. The Roundglass India Center staff, Shannon, Stephanie, and I see Roundglass Foundation folks here too, Sangeeta, the university events and catering, as well as our tech group. So to start our conversation with Karthick, as we head into these presidential elections in November, right, these issues we're discussing today are timely and important. How do Indian Americans vote? Thank you for being here, first of all. But what I'm curious about in particular, right, to frame this conversation, it's a large topic. Let's take a hypothetical, and that's what we law professors do best, is hypotheticals. So let's say that we had Nikki Haley had won the Republican nomination and was running against Biden, right? How do we think that Indian American voters might have voted, right? And even though the question is fiction, in some ways it might be a reality. We have one VP candidate that's of Indian descent, and we have potentially another one that Trump might, for example, have Vivek as his candidate. So that's kind of the framing question I wanted to ask you, and then we can break it down as well. I don't know if you wanted to first comment on anything.
Let's take that, and then well, first of all, thank you, Sital and everyone else here. Yeah, so in terms of party identification being a strong among Asian Americans, we're the only racial group that is majority foreign born, and especially Indian Americans among the more recently arrived, right? If you look at the 20th century, you didn't see a big wave of Indian immigration really until the 1980s. Whereas for other groups like Chinese Americans and Japanese Americans, they've had much bigger presence for longer periods of time. So immigrants don't grow up in a Democratic household or a Republican household, right? And so if that's the single biggest predictor of how you will end up voting, we don't have that. And also, we didn't grow up, if people got their college degrees where they get politicized, most Asian Americans, most Indian Americans got their college degrees in India, in Asia. And so there's a lot of room for persuasion, potentially. And I say that because another important feature of American society is not just getting socialized into a party system, it's getting socialized into race. Right? And so the way that race and politics play out serve as kind of constraints. So Indian Americans, by and large, vote Democratic. Of course, there are Indian American Republicans, including Nikki Haley. Vivek Ramaswamy, Bobby Jindal, and a whole bunch of other people who served in the Trump administration, for example, in senior roles. But if you look at the data on voters, if you look at the data on campaign contributions, look at the data on people running for office, by and large, about a 3-to-1 ratio, Democrat over Republican. For Asian Americans in general, it's about a 2-to-1 ratio, Democrat over Republican. So those are things to keep in mind. And if you look at our survey data, I believe it was in our October 2023 survey that we did with the Associated Press and NORC, you can find it on our website, that we asked for favorability ratings for everyone. And Biden, was, I believe, just below 50%. Someone like Trump was much below that. Haley didn't do that much better among Indian Americans than Trump did. Ramaswamy did not do that much better among Indian Americans than Trump did. So Indian American voters are sophisticated voters. So they might have some sense of pride, but yeah.
No, so it's super interesting. I think maybe this is what now it might be working. It's super interesting that it's counterintuitive, right? The whole premise, we think there's some allegiance, some sort of tribal allegiance with respect when you see a candidate that maybe looks like you, but you're saying, hey, it might be more on the basis of what their politics are, right? And just to give people a little background, right? You get all this information from huge surveys that you do, kind of really statistically significant and massive sample size, sort of almost like Gallup surveys, right? That's how do you want to?
Oh, I think we're better than Gallup,
okay.
Especially when it comes to understanding our communities. So if you look at Gallup, if they ever report data on Asians, it will not have language support. And we know that that's an important thing to do. Actually, I will say among our Indian American sample, we don't offer language support beyond English. These are really difficult to do. But for Asian Americans, like I have greater confidence in our data because of that language support. But yes, we've been collecting data over years, and there are many different surveys that all point to the same thing. I'll just say this, right? In fact, sometimes when I talk to reporters, they'll be like, oh, I know so many Indian American Trump voters. Are you sure your data are right? And I'm like, well, it's not just our data, but other people's data that are all pointing in the same direction. Campaign contribution data also points in that direction. So yes, most of the people may be Trump voters. First of all, you actually don't know if they're Trump voters. They might say that they are for various reasons, for bravado and whatever people might say it. What they do in the voting booth is up to them. But in our surveys and others, we see this consistent finding. And it's not, what matters, one, you might ask, why are Indian Americans Democratic leaning for the most part? By the way, they're still persuadable. And we saw between 2016 and 2020, Trump made inroads among Indian American men. And if you drill down deeper, Indian American foreign-born men, middle-aged. He also made progress among other men of color too. He did lose the Indian American vote and the Indian American male vote. So these are all things important to keep in mind, that yes, even as we think of party identification is really strong, there's room for movement. Final thing I'll say about why party identification among Asian American voters and especially Indian American voters. If you look at Asian American voting patterns using exit poll data, they're limited. But if you look at exit polling data between 1992 and 2012, Asian Americans had the biggest swing of any group. They went from being pro-Republican to being strongly pro-Democrat. We have never seen this kind of pattern in this time period. The only other time in American history we've seen it is during the New Deal era. So it's like, why did this happen? Right? And I wrote a piece in the American Prospect about this. I was invited to write it. Two factors. One is the Democratic Party did a lot of outreach under Bill Clinton and Hillary Clinton, and they recruited people to run for office and moderated their stances, right? Especially among Indian American doctors, like when they tried to roll out healthcare reform, that was a disaster. So they did a lot to reach out to the community, and they did a lot in terms of getting people appointed to office. The next major thing, so that's kind of set of pull factors. Set of push factors happened after 9/11. So you had racial profiling, racial discrimination, and the Republican Party was not seen as a viable option, as a welcoming home for Asian Americans and especially South Asians, Indian Americans. So even if you thought, you know what, I kind of like some of these Republican ideas, you cannot bring yourself to call yourself a Republican, and you feel unwelcome in Republican circles because of the rise of, nationalism, xenophobia in the Republican Party. Democratic Party seems like a much more hospitable home for people who care about racial discrimination.
That's super interesting. So one question, you talked about how Democrat sort of went out and try to speak to Indians and Indian Americans, right? Now, my question is, like, there are only 4 million people of Indian descent in this country, and some small subset of those are citizens, so they can vote, and some smaller subset of those actually vote. So why is this disproportionate, or this level of attention, right? I mean, when Trump ran 4 years ago, he spoke in Hindi, right? Up ke baar, Trump sarkar, right? So so why? Why do we care? Why do they care?
Yeah. First, let's break down the numbers, right? So
down.
you have about 4 million Indian American residents, actually a little bit bigger than that now. By the way, it's so important, and I'm proud that I've, started AAPI Data, and I'm the leader of it. We have an amazing team that when many people think about Asian Americans, they don't think about Indian Americans. But how many of you know, for example, if you look at the race alone population, so people who identify with one race, that Indian Americans are the largest Asian American group in America today? How many people knew that? That crossover just happened in 2020, right? And so what I say is you cannot talk about the Asian American community without talking about the Indian American community. We are that essential, right? So a little over 4 million, if you look at the total resident population. If you look at the adult citizen population, 2 million. And then if you look at voter turnout among those eligible, estimates vary, but something like 3/4 of those who are eligible to vote do vote. By the way, those are some pretty high turnout figures, right? And so that's important to acknowledge. Another thing about the Indian American population compared to other Asian American groups is that Indian Americans tend to be more spread out across the country. So if you look at something like the Filipino population, 40% of the national Filipino population lives in California. California is not competitive for a presidential election. It is competitive in some of these congressional races, though. And the tip of the U.S. control of U.S. House of Representatives this year will depend to some extent on Asian American turnout and Indian American turnout. So Indian Americans, it's because of the occupational background, right? If you talk about motel owners to doctors to professors and tech workers, like they are spread out throughout the country. And so in terms of like the Georgia election story, in terms of the Senate election, Indian Americans played a significant role there. And people may be surprised. But part of the thing is what's happening is because you have such strong and entrenched party competition and close electoral races, even if you're 0.5% of the electorate, you will make a difference. And campaigns that do not know how to reach out to our communities will win or lose based on that. And so that's why you're seeing a lot more investment in our communities now than you did before.
So I think that while I think that, yes, there's a lot more investment, and I agree with you, and my question kind of prompted you to say this, but I also feel that they are not, at least the Democratic Party and possibly Republican, they're not necessarily desegregating Asian American in the way that they could and they should, and it might be actually better for them, both in terms of getting more political contributions and in terms of getting people more excited about voting and voter turnout.
Yeah, so I've been in this game as a researcher for about 20 years now. Actually, more than 20 years. I'm getting old. 25 years as a researcher. National Asian American Survey we started in 2008, and I've seen over time both parties taking our communities more seriously and starting to invest to understanding the nuances within the community. We're also living in the era of big data, so there's a lot more insights that people gain based on consumption patterns, web traffic, web utilization patterns and the like, so that, if you're on social media, you will, through YouTube, through Facebook and whatever, start getting ads that cater to you based on everything else that you're clicking. So the parties are actually getting quite sophisticated in terms of having a better understanding, and they're investing. I will give the Republican Party some credit here, right? So in 2012, after Mitt Romney lost the election, the Republican National Committee created this massive, they had this big study. They called it the autopsy report. That was the kind of the informal name, but it was called the Growth and Opportunity Project. It spells GOP. They put out a massive report in 2013, and it had three recommendations. One, accept immigration reform. Two, this is not just for Asian Americans. So how to woo Asian American, Latino, and Black voters and young voters and female, basically like most of America, but that was like, how do you make inroads, right? So one was pass immigration reform. Shocking as it might sound, people like Bill O'Reilly and major Republicans said we need to pass immigration reform in 2013. Second, show up in communities and don't take the vote for granted, either that you're going to get the vote or the Democratic Party is going to get the vote. You need to compete for the votes. So you need to show up. And three, run Asian Americans under the Republican banner. Recruit candidates and run them. And they've done it. They've done it in Orange County. They've done it in Nevada. They've done it in New Jersey. Those were the initial pilot cases. Now, Donald Trump, when he showed up in 2016, kind of trashed that playbook. He showed that you do not need to pass immigration reform. In fact, you can start off your campaign denigrating immigrants and still win a national election. That said, the Republican National Committee and various state and county committees are not Donald Trump, even though they're significantly under his sway. So the work of parties and candidates at the state and local level to continue to recruit proceeds. And that has made the Democratic Party take Asian American voters and Indian American voters and donors more seriously. There is a competition underfoot, and so they are not taking it for granted the way they might have in the past.
And I remember there was a survey that came out from the Carnegie Foundation in 4 years ago when Harris was on the ticket, and they did find that, like you, that while it didn't necessarily affect the way they were going to vote, Indian Americans, there was a lot of enthusiasm, right?
Yeah.
So it's similar to what you're saying. People are excited, and maybe it gets people out to vote more than necessarily than perhaps how they're going to vote. And I think that's important to point out. The other thing, and you can comment.
Oh, but just quickly on that, especially when you go beyond presidential, when it comes to campaign, if you look at candidates running for office, Indian American candidates for running for office, absolutely tapping Indian American donors, not only from their district, but throughout the country, is an important part of that strategy. And that's why you've seen a significant growth. There's a group called Indian American Impact that endorses candidates and encourages them to run. And over time, you've seen this tremendous increase, right? It happened in a less organized fashion, but the donor class and the candidate class, it's all kind of moving in that direction. You're seeing a significant increase.
Following on that topic, right? Why are Indian, it seems, amongst possibly, you tell me, certainly Asian groups, possibly even other immigrant groups, they're disproportionately represented vis-a-vis those immigrant groups in national and in local politics, but also disproportionately vis-a-vis Indian Americans as well, the community. And why do you think that is? And first, is it true? Can you tell me the data? And two, why do you think that is?
Yeah. So it all depends on what is your baseline expectation, right? So if you're looking at our share of the population, I think we're running a little bit below parity. But really what you probably should look at is our share of the eligible voter population. And then we're above parity when it comes to that. Several factors at play. One thing so I will be that person. I'll go back to my dissertation days and talk about, even when I looked at it in terms of voting participation, one of the questions I asked was, does it matter what kind of country you come from, whether you come from a democratic regime or a non-democratic regime? And at the time, people thought, okay, if you're a Cuban or Vietnamese, you have these people who come from communist countries, super agitated and excited to vote, and they vote. So maybe if you're a political refugee or you come from a repressive country, you're more likely to vote. When I looked at the data, I found actually the reverse was true. That if you came from a democratic country, you're more likely to vote than if you didn't. So that's the first thing I would say. Indian Americans come People can disagree about the quality of the democracy in India right now, but they come from a country that has competitive elections. They have political parties that have certain issues that they stake themselves on. So they have that experience. On top of that, high English proficiency compared to other Asian American groups, right? So those two factors make a difference. I also think our experiences as brown people in this country also makes a difference. So when you look not only at people running for office, if you look at people that are leading up civil rights organizations, Indian Americans are disproportionately in leadership positions, right? And if you look at the Biden administration, there's so many Indian Americans in senior leadership roles, and it's because they cut their teeth in grassroots organizations. Here we're in Seattle, look at someone like Pramila Jayapal, right? Started an immigrant rights organization and used that as the basis for mobilization. So this is something you see time and again. Final thing I'll say, even though you didn't ask about this, like when it comes to racial attitudes, a lot of people, maybe I'm old, I have enough gray hair to show it. If you look at Mississippi Masala, there's a sense that Indian Americans are anti-Black, racist, and there's lots of tensions between Indian Americans and Black people. But in fact, if you look at the data, the public opinion data, and also when Indian Americans, by and large, show up, it is in solidarity with Black communities. Of course, you're going to have someone like Vivek Ramaswamy who goes in the other direction. But that is the exception that proves the rule. That Indian Americans, part of their leadership is knowing how to be adept at doing coalition work, right? And getting to office. Pramila Jayapal does not live in a majority Asian district or a majority Indian American district. But she won because of the kind of coalition building she was able to do. And that's more generally what you see among Asian Americans who succeed and Indian Americans who succeed when they run for office.
Super interesting. So in all of the polling you've done, what are the issues of concern of Indian American voters? And I understand you also had something about environment that recently came up.
Yeah. So I will encourage you to go to aapidata.com and to our surveys. You can go to apnorc.org as well. And if you click on the API data tag, you'll see this. First of all, I'll just say, like, I'm in my wildest dreams, I would not have imagined that we are here where today. So I started survey research in 2008, and we did surveys every 4 years. Starting in 2014, we did it every 2 years with API Vote and AJC. It's called the Asian American Voter Survey, and that'll be coming out in July of this year as well. Starting in the fall, we have been doing monthly surveys of our community with the Associated Press and NORC, which is just incredible. And we did it to fill a void. So if people want to know, where do Asian Americans stand on Israel-Gaza? Prior to our surveys, you wouldn't know the answer to that question. People want to know, where do we stand on abortion policy around the time that there are some important Supreme Court cases coming up? You wouldn't know that without looking at this set of surveys that we've done, and we've done it. So I would encourage you, actually, I would urge you all to please use the data, because this is decades of work that has gotten us to this position, but these data are not useful or meaningful if people don't actually have awareness of it and to use it in their daily conversations. And because we have evidence about our communities now, we don't have to rely on assumptions. We don't have to rely on stereotype. The most recent survey, that's actually the one just prior to this, we asked a question in a very innovative way, which is, so in January, we have data in terms of what are the issues that matter in our community. The economy and inflation matters, but there are other issues, including the environment, including abortion, including immigration, that also matter. We are not a single issue community, but those are the issues that matter. We had a bunch of questions on abortion in this last survey, and like off the charts in terms of where we are compared to the general population, either as Indian Americans or as Asian Americans more generally. And then finally, environment. We have a webinar that's coming up on Tuesday. I think it's on social media where you can sign up, or you can go to API Vote, which is our partner. And we see that we index very high on the environment. Final thing I'll say, we had this innovative question that we asked, which was if there was such a thing as a single issue voter. So it's not just what issues matter to you, but we basically asked, is there an issue that is important to you that if a candidate holds a different position, you would not vote for that candidate? Going into it, I thought that Israel-Gaza would be the top choice. In fact, it was at the bottom of the list. Guess what the top choice was?
Not.
This blew my mind. The top choice was racism and discrimination. And so what that tells you, how many people in the media are talking about how racism is going to play a role in this election? Virtually nobody, right? But what that tells me is that, and this is why ultimately, very likely, Biden will win the Asian American vote, is that even if people have certain frustrations on policy, Trump has a ceiling. He cannot break that ceiling given who he is and his rhetoric. Number 2 issue, abortion policy. And we saw that with Arizona now. And so these are going to be some very severe constraints, so that if Trump and other Republicans are trying to make inroads in the Indian American community, those are going to be no-go areas. So that's really important. And I hope more people read that. Final thing I'll say is on the environment. I've been doing this for a while, right? And here we are in Seattle in the Pacific Northwest, strong environmentalist movement, a lot of strong organizations, either on the interest group side or among elected officials. How many people are thinking of Asian American voters as environmental voters? How many people are investing in our communities in terms of increasing the membership of environmental groups, increasing the donors to environmental groups? I would venture to guess that is very small. So I hope that data like this can open people's eyes and to really think about our communities, even though we started talking about Nikki Haley, right? And Vivek Ramaswamy, it's like when you think about our political agenda, our policy agenda, issues like the environment, issues like abortion, issues like gun control, issues like immigration, all of these things matter. And people who are able to speak to our communities and reach out to our communities, whether they are politicians running for office, their parties, or interest groups that are trying to increase the number of donors to their organization, they will succeed if they understand and invest.
Great, thank you. That is super interesting and helpful. To go in, using this train of thought, I'm wondering whether there's specific issues relating to India or Indian Americans. The sort of list of issues you talked about are sort of national politics, potentially, right? Racism, abortion. But are there anything, and maybe you didn't pull on it really, so maybe that's the answer, but are there issues particularly like related to, the visas or the immigration problems that Indian Americans might face? Or are there issues perhaps related to India-US relations? I know that when 4 years ago, the Carnegie Foundation asked the question about US-India relations, apparently because Trump was trumping up his connection to Modi. Yes, exactly. And, and talking about that, but apparently Indian American voters didn't necessarily care about that. That is what that Carnegie Foundation found. So are there specific Indian American issues? And then B, I think the other thing we haven't really talked about is, we can't think of the Indian American community as a monolith. There are some people who are one voters and not voters, right? So the recently immigrated people might be different in thinking about it than the been here for a while or the born here for a while.
Absolutely. Okay, so there's like 3 questions in there.
Yeah.
So first, let me say in terms of U.S.-India relations, politics in the homeland, what we have seen consistently over the years is that those issues are pretty low in salience. And that might surprise people. So again, if all you're doing, I don't know what publication people read here, but in the East Coast, if all you did was read India Abroad, you're like, oh my God, India, Pakistan stuff, this is the biggest thing on people's minds. And it's actually, no, it is actually very, very low when it comes to voters' priorities. And it's these other issues that matter. It's not to say that they're not important, because some of them have the wealth and the resources and the tenacity to engage and organize on those issues. But generally speaking, that doesn't matter. Another thing, not that you asked about this, but when, one of the big things, people are like, okay, if you have Indian Americans who are generally favorable towards Modi, does that mean that they'll vote for Trump? And we did not explicitly ask about that, or maybe one of our surveys had a favorability on Modi, but we did not see evidence of somehow, like people are complicated, people are complex, right? And I say this even based on like conversations with people that I know in the community that can, on the one hand, be against Trump because of his racism and then be okay with Modi, even if there might be a different kind of oppression going on in India. So people simultaneously can hold on to those things. And so you don't see that kind of pressure from, say, homeland politics, like shifting here or vice versa, right? People are able to compartmentalize and separate. Okay, you had also asked, okay, there are a couple of other things you asked.
It's differentiating how the recently
Recently immigrant, right?
Versus born here versus even been here for 10
Yeah,
plus years.
absolutely. So this is like, so this is really important. This is why we need to continue to survey our community and not take it for granted, right? Remember I said between 1992 and 2012, you saw this enormous shift. One of the reasons might have been, hey, you had more South Asians kind of in the mix. And so maybe that accounts for it. We actually looked at it, and that shift doesn't matter as much because you saw a decline in the share of the Japanese American population that is also very democratic. And then you saw an increase. So it's a kind of substitution effect that's happening. But yeah, there are different things that matter in terms of the ideas that people bring in with them, but also things that happen in American society, like 9/11, like COVID-19, and the kind of xenophobia that like emerges out of each of those things. Those are important socialization moments. Finally, so these are, I'm hoping to have more time to write. And if I had the time to write, I would say the two most powerful factors that shape how immigrants vote are party polarization and party identification and racialization in America. So even if you're Indian American and you're more recent, by the time you become a citizen, chances are quite high that you've experienced racial discrimination. And so then it's just really, especially the way the parties are arranged on issues of race right now, it's less likely, but it's not impossible, right? So remember, there's still about a quarter of Indian Americans who will probably vote Republican and donate Republican and the like. But it's hard for me to see right now the way the parties are arranged and the way that race works in America right now to see a dramatic shift based on new waves of Indian immigration.
So we do have some time for questions from people who are in Zoom live stream or people from the audience. And if you have any, you may ask your question and just quickly make it short and then I'll repeat it so people can hear. Go ahead.
So one more question, religion question.
So, okay, do you know what religion? So how does the religion of the voter make a difference, or how does?
In the US, it appears that they're looking for sort of biggest factor in the deal around. The religion, which I think if you're really paying attention, anyone could know, I would be unsurprised to find that there is a factor, even though it's would be that easy to tease out whether it is and how, whether it is religion and how it works. But I was also surprised that didn't come up at all. Possible that you guys are looking at it as a live wire.
Yeah. So
do you want to repeat the question?
Yeah. So the question is, what about the role of religion? So absolutely. So I mean, in these surveys, we ask question about religion, people's religious affiliation. Turns out that those factors don't matter as much. And that might be surprising, right? So yes, religion matters in America, but it's religion in the context of race. You might have heard the expression, the most segregated hour in America is on Sunday morning, right? And so even if you talk about evangelical voters, if you're a white evangelical voter, it's very different than if you are a Latino evangelical voter, even though some of that stuff changes over time. Latino evangelical voters are more conservative than Latino Catholic voters and those who do not affiliate. Let's look at the Indian American population, right? So Indian American population, you have a religious diversity in terms of Hindus, Christians, Muslims, Sikhs, and the like. But in terms of religiosity, not as high as other groups in America. And you have a fair number of people that don't identify or who are not active in their religion. finally, I'll say for many Indian American religions, the political kind of relevance of religion is nothing like what it looks like for the Black Protestant church or the white evangelical church. And so yes, religion, absolutely, we need to pay attention to it, but it is kind of interesting that race plays a bigger role. We haven't talked about gender, right? And yes, there are gender differences within the community, but again, I mean, this is for better or worse as a particular feature of American society, especially where we are today. Race matters a lot more than gender in terms of structuring public opinion, structuring party identification, and how people vote on issues.
So religion, though, keeping on this topic, what about we're talking about voters. I'm curious about the people who run. And this also ties into the question of, how Indian American candidates present themselves, right? Some have converted out of their religion, some don't emphasize the Indian American, some do emphasize. So what are the themes and trends and rationale of this?
I mean, I see change over time, and I will say progress, right? I think, when you had someone like Bobby Jindal, he basically, if you try to make sense of Bobby Jindal, right? It's we could spend a few days trying to analyze this, but if you try to make sense of it, you see someone who feels like he had to run away from certain parts of his identity in order to succeed in the Republican Party. And that's why I would say, to me, it's interesting to look at Vivek Ramaswamy, to be like, wow, like you can have a name like Vivek Ramaswamy and be a Hindu and still do okay. He did better than a lot of other people. But I think even that maybe tells you what it takes to succeed. Like Vivek Ramaswamy was not just any typical candidate. His ideas were so wild and crazy that you kind of forgot that he was this brown dude who is Hindu, who, with all the other things. He would bring it up, but the big things was the craziness of his ideas, like raising the voting age to 25 or something like that. Like he had all sorts of ideas. So he was the candidate of the zaniest ideas, and that's what got him attention. But then if you look at people like Pramila Jayapal, if you look at people like Raja Krishnamurthy, and this is where will take a step back. If you look at Indian Americans in leadership positions in the corporate world and other worlds, part of what gives me hope is that you do not need to change your name. You do not need to change your religion. There is still racial discrimination in this country, but you do not need to anglicize your name in order to succeed. And I think that's progress.
So, given the volatility of the current times, one of the biggest thing that comes to my mind is the age of the two candidates that everybody talks about. And given the fact that you are doing now your surveys every month, I am wondering if you're also asking the people, God forbid, if something happens to one of these old men, the two people in the wings on the Democratic side is Kamala Harris, once again Indian American, and on the other side is Nikki Haley, also Indian American. And so are you asking any questions to get information about what happens if between now and November is a very long time for very old people?
Yeah, no, great question. I had written a piece on CNN.com after Nikki Haley spoke at the Republican National Convention in 2020 to say that this could be, was it in 2020? I think so. Or maybe it's 2016. I think it was in 2020. But that this could be a preview of what we see in 2008, right? Or 2028, or something like that, looking ahead, that it could be a Haley-Harris matchup. That I think would be interesting, right? It's different from the hypothetical matchup that you threw on there. And both of these candidates, it's like and it's true of any candidate, they will trot out like like Harris had like the samosa making or something. Like, it's like people will trot out the kind of the ethnic aspects in selective ways if it can help them, either humanize them for a general audience or to connect, with particular sets of voters. But yeah, in terms of what that could look like, it's
I'm not talking.
Yeah, so in 2024, I would still say party ID would largely make a difference. I do, I have teenagers that are not yet of voting age. They are frustrated with these very old people clinging on to power. I think in general, you see that in American society. Like young people are seeing just older folks that are holding on to leadership positions and power and even their homes, if you will, like in all sorts of ways when it comes to leadership, when it comes to economic opportunities. I think that's an important question to answer. One thing I will say, I'll plug this latest survey. It's already up on the AP Norc website. We're going to have a webinar on it on Tuesday. One of the things that gives me hope when it comes to climate, for example, in that context, people are very concerned about future generations. And that's part of some of the other work I'm doing outside of the API data context. I'm a strategy lead for the Americas for School of International Futures. And a lot of that is about intergenerational work. I think we need to move beyond intergenerational conflict to intergenerational dialogue and to actually start getting better at intergenerational planning. When it comes to things that range from the future of Social Security and Medicare to the future of our planet, we have to listen to young people, elevate them as quickly as possible, because the future of our country, the future of our planet depends on it.
Can I just follow up on that, using home turf advantage to grab the mic from Archana? Karthik, thank you so much. Very quick question, and then to you. I saw your hand up. So your database is dynamic, and obviously we're going to lose that majority foreign-born population moniker pretty soon, as you alluded to the new generation coming up. I was surprised. I actually thought immigration reform would be the top issue. You said abortion was one of those. Do you think support for that is going to start to wane?
Yeah. So yeah.
And then I just stuck my second question in. The second question is representation. As you see, we see these candidates, but there's no money. Is there money going to these candidates? How much do we pay a congressperson? Pramila told me her salary, and I was like laughing. And I said, how do you even manage? And she's like, no money comes to, everybody likes to see their Desi candidate up there, but there's no money that comes in of the nature that should. So what's your opinion on that?
Okay. Second thing is a complicated one, because in the sense that, you can't receive money outside of campaign funds. So if you wanted to help Pramila Jayapal economically, you could not. Right? That would be corruption and bribery. You could not do that. But you can contribute to campaign accounts. And this is the thing, like among Indian Americans, you actually see, right? Pramila's story and others is one in which Indian American donors, like it keeps growing. There's still room to grow. It might not be as strong as other communities, including, say, American Jewish communities and their kind of fundraising prowess. But Indian Americans are getting there. We are well on that path, in terms of fundraising for campaigns. In terms of immigration, so there's two different types of questions. One was this kind of single issue voter litmus test kind of question. Immigration was number 2 when we asked about the most important question, but that is true for Republicans as well as Democrats. So for Republicans, it is border control. But this is also, and I'll get back to that in a second, for Democrats, it's immigration reform. So it still matters. I'll also say, even as we see the growth of the second generation in the Indian American community, we are going to be majority foreign-born voters for at least a couple of decades. That is not going to change, because you continue to see large-scale immigration from India to the U.S. or people waiting for H-1Bs, finally getting their green cards, and then becoming citizens, right? So you're going to continue to see that play a significant role. But yeah, the way immigration plays out will be through the lens of party, but it'll still largely be pro-immigration reform, in the foreseeable future. I think I answered your questions.
And just wondering what you think of that, number one. And I will just have to say I'm not so happy with that. And how do we change that so we can get more voices and we can get more.
Oh, okay. All right. So more than the two parties that we have is the question. Okay. So by the way, so when I was a graduate student in the late 90s, early 2000s, you had all these articles about the decline of parties and bemoaning the decline of parties, right? If you look at periods of strong parties in the US, birth of the party system with Andrew Jackson, then you had the Civil War period, the things that led to the Civil War. You had some very dynamic things going on in the parties. And then the New Deal era was a very strong kind of party era. And that continued, especially with Lyndon Johnson, too. Like those were like eras of very strong parties, sharp dividing lines between what the parties stood for. And then when you got to the 90s, especially with Bill Clinton and like the Democratic Leadership Council, you're like, whoa, this looks like there's not much difference between the parties. They're center right, center left. And so parties don't matter as much. I guess you got to be careful what you wish for, because now you have some pretty strong party polarization. And so that sets the terms. Yeah, I mean, on the one hand, you can bemoan it, but it's a feature of the American party system and the political system. There's a lot of political science research on what it is, but third parties do not last long in America. If they last, it's usually as a protest vote or a kind of particular geographic region, right? So the Southern Democratic Party, you had certain third parties that came in that tried to exploit differences between Republicans and Democrats after the New Deal era, right? And after civil rights. But it was a very short-lived prospect. The only time a third party has succeeded is the Republican Party. Right before the Civil War, the Whig Party collapsed and the Republican Party filled in. But usually it's because of our first past the winner take all system and the nature of American society that, I hate to say, like green parties, libertarian parties, and the like, they will not last long. And that's been the story of America.
So some questions coming in from our live stream audience. There's sort of a set of questions that relate around Indian Americans as donors. We've talked about them as voters, as candidates, but what, many of the questions sort of are like, are they important because they're donating a lot of money? Are they donating disproportionate amount of money? Is the donation make a difference? And of course, the obvious is that it is one of the most average per capita wealthiest ethnic group or any group in the entire country.
Yeah.
So how does that make a difference?
Great. One thing I'll just say to finish up on the party, I think lest I say that parties, have a lot of kind of negative images associated with them. But one of the ways we can think about parties is that they serve an integrating function too. So if we think about race and religion that could cause social divisions in this country, within the parties, there is the possibility that they can serve that kind of integration function. There's a possibility. One of the things that worries me is to have one party that is predominantly white and another party that is seen as a safer home for communities of color. So it's in the political science literature, they talk about overlapping cleavages and cross-cutting cleavages. When you have race and party, two very powerful drivers in American society, start to converge in the same way, that is really, we're seeing that. It's happening right now, right? I think in order to have a responsible party system, including a responsible Republican Party, we need to have more Latino Republicans, Asian Republicans, Indian Republicans, and the like. But it's really tough because the positions they're taking right now is what Donald Trump showed in 2016 is you can continue to succeed by ignoring the wishes of these populations and continue to win elections. And that'll probably be true for another decade, maybe more. So that's part of the danger. In terms of donors and where Indian Americans are, it's hard now to measure this, but there have been a couple of attempts, including a former graduate student of mine who did that as part of his dissertation. There was also an analysis by someone, Drumil Mehta in 538, analyzing Federal Election Commission contribution data to congressional offices. All right, what both of these show is that there's been a significant increase over time in terms of political contributions, and it's largely to Democrats over Republicans. And this is where it's the candidates who run. It ends up being this circular process, right? more Indian American candidates run under the Democratic banner. They will recruit donations among their donor circles. And even if that person was not a hardcore Democrat, over time, they will become hardcore Democratic donors and they'll start donating to other Democratic candidates. I have not donated. I am no party preference. I've been so for ever since I started my post PhD career. And so I am less likely. So I don't know this world, but I talk to my parents who complain about all the emails and text messages they get from all sorts of candidates. You donate to one person, you get sucked in to that vortex. But that is party identification at work. That is then how you become a donor to other types of candidates. So yes, Indian Americans are increasing. It's so funny. When I was a grad student, I remember going to some of these, and maybe some of these conversations happen. People in Indian American like conferences and gatherings saying like, we need to be more like the Jewish American community. Look how strong and effective they are. They're not that large, but they're able to work across and like fundraise and do this. Thinking back on it then, it's like you're seeing this pattern going down in that way. But I think there are two things that are different, but even some of that one of those might be changing. One is if you look at the synagogue tradition and kind of like the strong social organization of Jewish Americans and religious life and social life, Hindu temples, Sikh gurudwaras like do not hold a candle to what that looks like. So that's still not there. Second is Israel and this and kind of the fundamental security and having a homeland for Jewish people as embodied in the state of Israel. You've seen that grow even stronger in the last 20 years so that people feel like an important part of their Jewish identity is tied up to Israel. You're starting to see some of that among Indian American voters, especially like pro-Hindu or Hindutva voters who feel like India is the homeland for Hindus. And so that is the thing that keeps us together. But unlike the Jewish American community, you have religious diversity in this country, you have political diversity, and not nowhere nearly the kind of solidarity and opinion there. So I think you probably won't get the same kind of thing. But finally, I'll just say this, like if people say, well, what is an Indian American agenda that could get these donors excited, these candidates running, these voters showing up? If you look at an Indian American agenda, I would say it's largely one that's similar to other Asian Americans. It's an agenda of inclusion. It's an agenda of non-discrimination. It's also an agenda of opportunity that you think the Republican Party could make inroads. No, it's the racism that gets in the way. Like they can't quite, find a way to say, hey, you came to this country seeking opportunity and we're the better party when it comes to economic opportunity and mobility. So, but that is something that I think potentially in the future could be a roadmap, right, to get a more competitive two-party system. But yeah, when it comes to donors, we're seeing an increase and it's tied to different factors. More people running for office, the longer you stay in this country, and it's the wealth you have, but I think that's the potential. Until about a decade ago, 2 decades ago, people were not asking Indian Americans to donate. Or if they donated, it's what they called the grip and grin. Indian American donors were not sophisticated. So they'll donate in order to get the photo with the politician, and that's it. There was no ask. Now our community does the asks. And so I think it is a more sophisticated donor community. It is a more sophisticated voter community. It's a more sophisticated elected official community than we've seen in the past.
Well, this was just a phenomenal conversation, and we've all been super enlightened by your talk. I wanted to make sure we keep to our time. It's just, I think what I loved about this particular topic in your conversation was sort of really putting the spotlight on, one piece of the Asian American community, which, as you say, is the largest now and is growing and is significantly important, both in terms of the candidates, in terms of voters, in terms of donors, in terms of the issues. So I love the opportunity to have you spotlight that and learn from you. And again, thank you so much, Karthik, for being here.
Well, thank you so much for this opportunity.